Hello and welcome back to my channel. Today I've got a cool video using a watercolor block stamping technique. Here is a look at the cards that we are going to create today, and let's get into this. So today's video is actually a collaboration that Tombow is doing with Waffle Flower Crafts, and I've got two of the new Tombow dual brush pen packs, the Retro and the Cottage. I really liked these packs because, as you can see as I'm pointing out, there's kind of like blending combinations built into these, but you also still get a rainbow spectrum. I also really like these two in particular because the Retro are bold colors and the Cottage is more of a muted tone. A look at the ink block or the acrylic blocks that I'm going to be using, a few different shapes, and some of the Waffle Flower Crafts stamp sets that I am going to be using. So I have got some Tim Holtz watercolor paper that I'm going to be using along with these Tombow dual brush markers. These markers are water-based, and so they're perfect for the technique that we are going to use. The big rectangle block is from Gina K. The circle block is from Catherine Puller Inks, and this kind of like funky curvy block is from Simon Says Stamp. So I started to get on my markers and then realized I really should be using my water media mat. So I went and pulled that out so that I could start getting inky and not ruin my nice mat. So I have chosen a selection of markers from the Retro pack for this first one. I'm kind of going to do a little bit of a modified rainbow. So using that, those kind of pink markers into the orange and then into the yellow. And what you want to do for this technique is just scribble down your color. You don't have to do it in stripes. You could do it completely and totally random, or really intentional. You can do it however you want. Scribble down the color, spray your block, and then do your best to position it in the center. I miss the center sometimes. And then put some heavy objects on it to weight it down. And you are going to want to wait about 5 minutes before you pick these off so that the color has time to seep into the paper. Now, on these first two examples, I probably could have used more water than I did. But in the end, I still really like how these turn out. Keep in mind that if you're going to use watercolor paper like I do, it can take a lot of water and a lot of color, but there's also texture that you're playing against that's working against you. And so you do need to use quite a bit of water to get the color seeped into all the little nooks and crannies of watercolor paper. So I've got that second block done, sprayed it, and now I am going to try to center it as best as I can on this second piece of watercolor paper. Just again, weighting it down with some stuff that's randomly on my table. And then after 5 minutes have passed, I am now lifting off and looking at my results. Sometimes there's a little bit of pooling, and to avoid muddying, what I do is I just sop it up with a paper towel. I then just clean off my block and set these aside to completely dry. So here's that second one, cleaning off that block, and I really loved how these two turned out. It was really fun. So I did not have enough room to do all three at once, so I'm just going ahead and doing that third one now. So I've got that much larger block. It's great if you have a larger stamp that you want to use in coordination with this. So I'm just taking a bunch of these markers and going ahead, and I'm just going to scribble these down in rainbow order. Everything that I have used is linked down below, so you can easily find it. So I'm just going through, scribbling again in kind of a rainbow order. And from there, I'm just going to once again spritz because this block is so large. I think I actually sprayed this one maybe 3 or 4 times. And I'm just using, what is the word for that? A spray bottle. This is the Tim Holtz Distress Sprayer, but I mean, really anyone could work. So just going in, gonna douse that with some water, and I used more water on this one, and in the end, it's probably the one that turned out the best. Now I'm just gonna go ahead and try to line that up straight, and then once again, put all my heavy stuff on it, weight it down, and I pick it up again after 5 minutes has passed. And here are the results that I get. And now I'm kind of moving everything off of my desk and moving away my media mat. And I've got these 3 pieces. In order to make sure that these are totally dry before I heat emboss on them, I am just drying these with my heat gun. And then what I'm going to do is, because some of these, it's really hard to get these perfectly straight, but that's okay because you can definitely clean it up with some rectangle dies. So I've got the A2 layers dies from Waffle Flower, and I'm just taking one that I kind of like the size of, trying to get my focal image centered, and then just going ahead and taping down with some purple tape the dies. The block piece with kind of that pink, orange, yellow right in the middle right now, that one ended up being pretty centered. So I was happy with it. And so I just left it as is. I didn't cut that one down, but the other 2 I did end up needing to cut down in the end. So just going ahead and adding on that die. This one was pretty off-centered, so it's really hard to line these up, the dies up, and not try to use the edges of the cardstock as what is straight, but you have to look at what is the block and use that. So I'm just going to go ahead and run these through my Gemini die cutting machine. And then once those are all die cut out, I can move on to the stamping. So I take this, the one that I use the Cottage markers on, take out my Misti, and I am going to be using the Oversized Hello stamp from Waffle Flower. And that basically perfectly fills up the image, the space that I've created a background for it on. So I've got the big hello, and I'm just going to go ahead and line that up on that space where I have done my watercolor block stamping. Get that as good as I can, and then I will use my anti-static powder tool just to remove any oil or residue that the embossing powder would want to stick to. I'm already dealing with potentially, I've dried this so it's not wet, but if it was wet, then everything would stick, and I just want it to stick to the areas where I use my VersaMark ink and stamp down that image. So I am just really going over that image, making sure that I get a really good impression. I also stamp it twice just because it is watercolor paper, and because of all of those little nooks and crannies that give us this kind of unique look, it's just hard to get into all of them and to make sure that there's ink in all of those spaces for the embossing powder to stick to. So now I'm going to leave that hello in the door and get out my embossing powder. So I'm going to use Hero Arts white embossing powder and just sprinkle that on, and then you'll be able to see where that stamping has been. And this does not get fully covered. This hello stamp is really large. There's a lot of surface area. Again, I'm working with cardstock that is not really conducive to heat embossing because of all of the textured elements of watercolor cardstock. But I do my best to get that totally covered, and then I will heat set it, and then I will end up stamping it again. So here is what it looks like after I have heat set it the first time, and I'm just finishing up that heat, that embossing. And because I have left my stamp in the exact same place, all I need to do is slide my cardstock back into that corner of my Misti, re-stamp it, and then I'll get the coverage that I'm looking for. So I'm just going to go ahead and, get my VersaMark back out, stamp it again, and just put the embossing powder right back on. You can do this without, even if you're not using watercolor paper, and if you keep going over the same stamp, it ends up being really, really smooth on regular paper. So that's a cool technique to try as well. So just making sure I get a really good image. Then I will coat my paper in the white Hero Arts embossing powder. And then once I have all of that embossing powder on there, I can go ahead and heat set it again. In the end, this still isn't perfect. There are a few gaps, but I really like the rustic quality of this. And because of those markers that are a little bit more muted, in the end, I just really like how this turned out. Off camera, I'm going to do the stamping and embossing for the other two cards. You've already seen how one of them goes, but I do want to show you how I'm going to go ahead and line up those stamped images. On this card on the right, I'm going to use the smaller lily from the Potted Lilies. And on the card on the left, I am going to use one of the little floral jars from Jars of Happiness, which is one of my all-time favorite Waffle Flower stamp sets. Here I am trying to figure out which one I am going to use, and I end up laying out one of the largest images, and in the end I just decided it was too large and I wanted there to be a little bit more color around the image. So I do end up picking a different jar, but I think honestly any of these jars would fit nicely in this little round circle. So you can kind of see how I'm going to go about stamping down these images, and then I will once again white heat emboss them. And then I will go ahead and stamp the sentiments onto these two cards. Moving on to assembly, because these are watercolor cardstocks and because they have been wet and they have been heat embossed, there can be some warping. For that, I suggest you use foam tape because foam tape is so sturdy that it will just hold everything into place and keep everything really flat. So I've already adhered two of these card panels down, and the card base I'm using is Nina Classic Crest Solar White 110 pound. And I'm just going to go ahead and pop all of these up, and that completes the cards for today. Please let me know in the comments down below if you've tried these dual brush water pens. I love these markers so much. I think that they're so much fun. I'm going to have another video up later this week showing some coloring with these markers. So please subscribe so that you can see that video as well. And I will catch you in that video. I hope that you have a great rest of your day. And thank you for subscribing.